I'm Jane Downs and I'll be the chair for this afternoon's session on Scapa Flow Heritage Management. So the first speaker, we have Professor Chris Rowland of 3D Viz Lab, Duncan of Jordanstone, University of Dundee, who will be speaking about the wrecks of Scapa digital exploration. Thank you.
My job with the University of Dundee is to run the 3D Viz Lab, which has been mentioned a couple of times today, which is great stuff. We do a lot of work up here with the museums and also the Scapa 100 organisation, and more recently with the Royal Oak 80 survey. So any excuse I get to come back up here and show what we've been doing, I will jump on the chance. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a 20-year history of how the wrecks of Scapa have been approached in terms of survey and visualization. The first recorded, I would say, in memory of Multibeam Surveys were the ScapaMAP project, which had two sections to it, ScapaMAP and then ScapaMAP 2, and they occurred between 2002 and ScapaMAP 2 finished in 2006. Now, the three main projects I'm going to refer to all use multibeam sonar, so I'll give you a sense of what that is in a second. And then I want to add at the end some work that we've been doing to expand what we can see with multibeam and starting to look at using photogrammetry underwater. Let's start off with a little bit of ScapaMAP, the 2002 version. So the aims were generally to fill gaps in knowledge about the condition of the subsea wrecks in Scapa Flow, particularly aimed at the German high seas fleet. And it was meant as a test case to see how you could manage these kind of decaying monuments really in Scottish waters. So a fairly ambitious approach really. And the report is available online. You can still get all the data from the report if you just do a search for ScapaMAP. It started actually by a PhD student, a chap called Ian Oxley, from Heriot-Watt University, and he worked along with quite a large team, Bobby Forbes, late of Solar Diving, and Heriot-Watt, Deanna Groom from University of St Andrews, and supported by Historic Scotland, which is now HES. Philip here, who's talking after me, is one of the key figures related to shipwrecks with HES. And then the team that I eventually joined, Martin Dean, Mark Lawrence, and Steve Lisco, with part of the University of St Andrews Archaeological Diving Unit. So they were responsible for a good few years looking and recording the historic shipwrecks around the whole of the UK, not just in Scotland, but they were very interested in Scapa because of the legacy wrecks from the scuttling. And the skipper they used on MV Scimitar was Dave Burden, and they had three American friends from the University of New Hampshire who joined the team as well. So that's generally the team. The team was very similar for the second project, or the second project, ScapaMAP 2 is a little bit smaller. So we're talking about multibeam sonar initially. So this is a sense of how you capture multibeam sonar. So we're using sound, sonar, sound. And the idea of the multibeams is to send down the swath of little pings of sound, and then the echo from those sounds is received by the sender, and the distance is calculated based on the speed of the echo. So if it's a quick return, you know it's something shallow in the way. If it's a longer return, you know it's deeper. So it's as simple as that, he says glibly. And we were using technology certainly in 2006, which is capable of 256 simultaneous pings of sound. So we're covering a fair range swath of data in one pass. And the resulting data from that would be what we call a 3D point cloud. So it's little points in space that define a surface. ScapaMAP started with a little bit of help. The Halliburton Subsea company in 2000 had provided data from a surveyor training session that was carried out in the flow. So they were training their own surveyors to go out on these big survey ships to look at topographical stuff on the seabed. It was mainly for oil and gas research. So they weren't really interested in small detail, so they ended up with data like this. So it looks a little bit like a kind of colorful Mediterranean or Red Sea sea slug, and not so much like SMS cone, which it represents. But this was typical of the kind of representation from multibeam sonar data that we were getting from the surveying industry. It's bathymetric, in other words, it's accurate in terms of measurement, The colours are purely related to the depth of the object. However, if you look at a bathymetric survey carried out in the Mediterranean Sea by a different company, they would represent the depth with different colours. So there's no universal standard, or there wasn't, and I still think there isn't, to represent accurately what the depth of the object was. These are done in around about 5 metre depth. So the dark blue is the deeper part of the sea, then the lighter blue is the surrounding seabed, roughly flat around the cone. Then the green is the deeper part of the wreck. And you see, it doesn't really make any kind of logical sense. There used to be, back in the 1800s, a method of describing this kind of data. Or they didn't have this kind of data, but they had observational data of things like mountains and landscapes. And they used to describe it as the sea to sky color scale. So the deepest stuff, the lower stuff would be dark blue. And then it would go to yellow because that's the color of the beach, a kind of brown yellow. And then it would go to green because that's the grass at the edge of the beach. And then it would go to a darker green, which is the top of the trees and so on. And white was the snow on the top of the mountains. So this whole kind of color scale is completely random based on observing nature in one particular environment. And it's been adopted for years, a very, very similar scale, which does a job in terms of giving you separation of depth or separation of height, but there's no logic to it. The colors don't actually mean anything. They have that one use. So carrying on, this is the data from Subsea, Halliburton Subsea. Thankfully, ScapaMAP team decided that method representing the data wasn't very useful. So they started adopting a meshing algorithm or display method that allowed you to see more features on the shipwreck. So this is the same ship, is the cone. Let's go back to the Halliburton image. Slight difference. It's the same tools that have been used to capture the data. So the difference is the choices of how that data is visualized. And that's where my team come in, because that's where we get excited. So this is quite a step forward in the approach. It's still taking the point clouds, the little dots in space, and stretching the surface to join them up, so filling in the gaps. And although it gives us much better than the previous methods of rendering the data, we still get this effect. So this is the same piece of data of the cone, looking at it from the end on. And you can see it looks still a bit jelly moldish, where any overhanging features are hidden by this kind of draping effect. But, as I said, it's still better than the earlier method. And you notice this has been colored using a completely different scheme. It's using a false light to give shadow and the sense of 3D. But the color ramping, the rainbow ramping of color has been dropped for this particular image. Although it was adopted again at the end of ScapaMAP, this is one of the posters that was provided as part of the final deliverables, and you can see we've been talking about 7 wrecks remaining. There are actually really 8 if we include the Bayern. The Bayern left its turrets behind, so it still shows the shape of the ship, and I'll show you in data later on just how interesting that site is. But 7 almost complete wrecks, and 1 with the turrets left. So they adopted back to the old style of rendering, just the jelly mold stuff, which gives you depth. Now, it's worthwhile pointing out that you probably noticed I'm a little bit skeptical about this rainbow method. I don't think it really helps us. But on this poster, all of the wrecks are shown using the same depth scale. So relative to each other, we can guess which one's the deepest, and it's the one with the bluest surrounding seabed. So we can actually make a comparison between them. We can estimate their depths relative to each other based on this color scheme. But as I said before, this isn't the same color scheme that a company in France would use or a company in Brazil would use. It's completely arbitrary. Okay, 2006 was the revisit to Scapa Flow of the ScapaMAP team. And this time it was a much shorter project, and they were really saying, can we spot any changes in the wreck structure over a 5-year period? So 2002 to 2006. So they would also do diver-led surveys to check out any changes. So they do the surface multibeam, and then send divers in to have a look and see, is the multibeam accurate? Okay, so the kind of test in the method is, are what we've seen in the data, what's actually happening on the seabed. So it's quite an interesting way of doing this. And it also gives us a chance to see how the resolution of the data improved over 5 years. So this is the cone again. If you imagine back to our little blobby version and then our draped version, which gave us better detail, this is just the point cloud. So they hadn't draped this. They came to a conclusion, which I agree with, that the point cloud itself gave you the best scientific data because you're not adding anything to it, you're not filling in gaps, you're not covering up cracks, which the surface method would show you. So quite an interesting way of doing it. And then I would say, unfortunately, with some of the images, they reverted to the rainbow mapping, but also compromised it slightly by not applying it to the seabed. So the point of this image was that the Brahma, it was a mine layer, sometimes referred to as a light cruiser, but that's not accurate. It's the one mine layer that's still in the flow. And where you can see the shape of purple and elongated sections pointing out to the left of the image, that is an impression of where the 3 funnels would have been on the ship. But there's actually no evidence in the original data that that's where the funnels, or any evidence of the funnels still remaining on the seabed. They would have deteriorated very quickly and most likely was salvaged in the first round of salvaging. So it's an impression of what should be there, slightly inaccurate data, but still higher resolution than 2002, as you'll see in this one. So on the left, you've got the mark graph, which is one of the 3 battleships remaining on the seabed. 2001 data shows, you get a sense, the ship is upside down with a slight lean to one side. And you can see some of the salvage damage in the middle, that kind of dark black areas where the heavy machinery was salvaged. And then this kind of sparse point cloud spreading out along the seabed. And then the 2006 data, you can see it's much higher resolution. It looks much more like a surface. You can see more detail. And again, the color ramp that they used in 2006 is different to the color ramp that was used in 2001. So we're getting color changes that are not consistent. So again, my personal bugbear, if you're going to use a system, stick to it and you can compare it. But certainly the results were better than 2001 and clearer and allowed you get a sense that the divers could actually go in and look for particular features they thought might have changed. So the conclusion of the project, so basically they agreed that rendering the point clouds gave you something that was a little bit more integrity than surfacing, which is good. And that particularly works when you get overhanging features where the surfacing method would cover those up, whereas the point cloud would, if you managed to get the data, it would actually reveal it. And as I said before, there's no university adopted color range, so that color ramping isn't that useful to us. So end of 2006, the finish of ScapaMAP. During the summer of 2006, the ADIS survey was commissioned by the Ministry of Defence to initially look at HMS Royal Oak using Multibeam again. And that was the team that I was involved with Mark Lawrence and Martin Dean. We were here for 5 days on the water. And the first 4 days were spent on the Royal Oak. That's what we were getting commissioned to do, is produce an accurate map and survey data on Multibeam. What condition is the Royal Oak in? Because it's full of munitions from when it went down. It's also been leaking oil pretty much since the day it sank, but really monitored around the 50s and 60s and recognized that you've got a massive shipwreck full of munitions, you've got leaking oil, and you've got a beautiful natural environment surrounding it. So potential disaster. So our job is really to go in and just see what condition it was in and potentially advise on how it should be managed. After we finished surveying the Royal Oak on the first 4 days, we got all the data we need, the conditions were perfect, and we had 1 day left. So the choice was either go home early or use that day. And we used that day to survey all of the 8 German fleet wrecks. So we spent about an hour on each one, which compared to the survey that followed ours, which is ScapaMAP 2, they were spending a day on each one. So we're kind of rushing it, but we're thinking it's an opportunity, let's grab the data while we can. A collaboration was between University of Dundee, where I was based, University of St Andrews, where the ADU, as it was then, was Martin Dean and Mark Lawrence were based. We then combined forces and we changed the ADU to becoming ADUS or ADIS. So we refer to this as the kind of ADIS surveys. And we changed it from the Archaeological Diving Unit to Advanced Underwater Surveys. So we kind of stole the letters and just changed the meaning a little bit. And this is the data we got from that 4 days of multibeam survey of the Royal Oak. Now, this image was produced in 2006, and we were given permission by the MOD to publish a few images. They had to double check everything and check with the Royal Oak Association that they were happy the images were being put out to press. And this image was released round about November 2006. And I just did a check at lunchtime. I regularly do this and just check online. We released it to the MOD. They put it out to the press. It's now on 25 million websites. I had a look randomly at some of those that Google image search was coming back with, and some of them are bots. So I say, let's take half of them off, which is being generous. So we're still over 10 million shares of this one image. So one of the reasons that we do this visualization is not just to survey the condition of a wreck for the MOD or for the UK government or other governments which we've worked with. It's actually to share the story, because the Royal Oak was a huge local story. The Royal Oak would have been salvaged if it wasn't for the people of Orkney in the 50s who stood up to the MOD and said, "You are not salvaging our wreck. That's a war grave. That's our people." And this connection Orkney has had with different navies for hundreds, if not thousands of years, is still very, very strong. And we had, coincidentally, last weekend was the 80th anniversary, I'm sure you all know, of the loss of the Royal Oak. And we presented to the Royal Oak Association over 200 people, plus Navy representatives in Kirkwall last Sunday. And we presented a lot of new data. And I'm going to show you a little bit of it at the end of this talk if I've got time. So this is our data from 2006, which gives you a pretty good idea of the general architecture of the ship. That damage on the bow is where the first torpedo hit. You can see the first and second turrets, and then if you look about midships, you can see the casement guns and also the mast on the seabed, and then the last two turrets, the X and Y turrets, and around to the stern and the rudder. The prop shafts, which you can just about see one of them in front of the rudder, is where the ensign was reattached last week, and we recorded all that, and those images went out to press and are in the public domain now. Quite an emotional thing every time we get involved in that. From the data on the final day, we got this kind of stuff. So this is the column, which you've already seen 3 or 4 times. But this is the same year that ScapaMAP 2 captured data. And we got this in an hour. We developed an app that allows you to view this stuff. And you can get this online. This is at seriousanimation.com. Anybody wants to have a quick look at that later, give me a shout and I'll point you to it. And we managed to get higher resolution data in an hour than our competitors or colleagues, I'll say, had managed in a day. We were quite smug about this, I have to say. The method was mainly down to Martin Dean, who designed this system called iShaps. And what it did was it took the sonar head from the hull of the boat and lowered it down by up to 15 meters to get closer to the target. So we were getting much higher resolution. The echo was coming back quicker, but the spaces were close together. The points were close together. So we were getting, with the same kit, slightly different deployment and a bit of thinking, we got much higher resolution. We shared all of this data with the dive skippers around Scapa Flow, and then we re-released when I developed a new method for the rendering, which with the same data gives a better way of displaying smaller detail. So Emily Turton's boats still use it on a daily basis. She'll have used it twice today. In fact, it's only 2 o'clock, so she's probably briefing somebody right now using this data. So we covered all the wrecks. So this is the Dresden, which I'll come back to, the Karlsruhe, the Bayern turrets. So can you see the 2 dents? There's the upside-down turrets towards the back of the image, and they're in a line exactly pretty much where the Bayern flipped over as she sank. Then the turrets dropped out because they only sat into their place, holding place, because of gravity. It was the weight of the turrets. They just sat there. So as soon as the ship flipped over, the turrets fell out. Then they picked up, for salvage, they picked up the main hull, and of course the turrets stayed on the seabed. And then as they were lifting it, the hoists broke, and the hull fell back down to the seabed. So we get this second dent at about a 45-degree angle, which is quite interesting. There's lots of little bits of debris in there as well. So jumping ahead, ShipTime survey was the most recent multi-beam survey in 2017. There isn't a report that goes with this yet. I'm hoping that might happen. But HES lent us the data to make comparisons. So this is an image of the Brahma that we just saw. So our data is on the top and ShipTime's at the bottom. And what we found is that we were able to, because it was basically a 11-year difference, so just over a decade difference, we're finding things that are quite interesting. If you look at the bilge keel on the ADIS data in the top, these have both been seen from directly above the wreck. You can see on the ShipTime data, 11 years later, it's moved further into the ship, and that's because the whole of the hull is rotating like this. And it's rotating because the deck is falling away. So as the deck falls away, there's nothing to hold that hull up, so it rotates and compresses down. So comparing that kind of data, we're also able to look at differences in things like the bow. And if you look on the left-hand side, ADIS data 2006 and the ShipTime on the right, the bow is collapsing at quite a considerable rate. And I would say, anecdotally, divers have been reporting since 2017 that this is now much flatter and almost completely on the seabed on the bow. So as the ships are deteriorating now after 100 years, in the last 10 years, there's a huge acceleration in the deterioration, which is stuff that we've got to start looking at, because it does open the ships up to further detail to be looked at, but also you've got to start asking questions as how do we conserve these, or how do we record them and make digital conservation. Again, back on the Brahma, if we look at the other end, at the stern, the ADIS data on the right shows the rudder is off the seabed. And the stern section, although it is damaged, you can see in 2017 that the rudders are right down on the seabed. I'll show you this in another one. But the separation of the decks is really kind of obvious there as well. So there you go. That's the rudder position, where it's now pretty much lying flat on the seabed, whereas 10 years ago, 11 years ago, it was pretty upright. So there's significant changes. And this is one of the really good things about multi-beam sonar. In 2006, we pretty much got the resolution as high as we could get it for these kind of depths. That's not really moved forwards, but what we can do is make direct comparisons between the data sets. And this is something we have to continue to do. So, we should be looking at every time there's an opportunity is get back in there. Maybe every 10 years, maybe it should be 5 years now, the faster deterioration. Same idea with the column. We can see on the right, towards the stern, there's a whole accommodation block with a turret on top of it, and on the left-hand side, you can see that has rotted away, and you can see the pedestal that goes through the decks for the turret. It's a slightly different story with the battleships. They were salvaged to within an inch of their lives back in the day, and you can see clearly from the data that those big holes in there are where the salvage blasting was. But you can still see to the right of the picture, that's the stern, and the two rudders are still pretty upright. And at the bow section, which is on the left, there's a hole there, which is where the torpedo tubes were extracted. So there's a whole area there that is full of very expensive metals. There's a little bit of missing data in the 2017 data. It looks like holes, but it's not. Those are actually still intact. So we think the reason that the larger ships haven't deteriorated as much is because they took a big hit on the salvage early on. That's where the big money was. So after that salvage process, they did settle quite quickly. And then they had stronger armor, there were stronger internal structures. The citadel, which is a kind of armored cage around the important bits, is still there. So they've kind of settled down. If you have the appetite to go and swim inside one of these, and I know others that do, I wouldn't recommend it, there is, again, anecdotal evidence that they are slowly compressing inside. So where gaps would have been swimmable, they're no longer swimmable, so they're finding other routes around them. Okay, so multi-beam sonar data, good stuff. It gives you accurate bathymetric, so scientific, coverage of the whole shipwreck. Disadvantages, it's produced with sound, so there's no color involved. And it uses what we call a sparse point cloud. If you get closer to these point clouds, you can see the gaps in between, so we lose detail. So we're starting to use photogrammetry to fill these gaps. So that's the Bayon turrets that we looked at earlier. if we use photogrammetry, we can get in there. We can't do photogrammetry from the surface. It has to be close up, usually diver led. So we get something like that. So that's multibeam. That's photogrammetry. Now, a huge advantage with photogrammetry is that we get close. We're within a meter of the structure when we're recording. So we also have to take light with us. It's an image-based process, so we get color and texture. And I'll give you a sense. This was captured by myself and my colleague Kari Hyttinen over 2 days, 2 dives, so about 90 minutes of diving. And the white dots that you can see there is the path that we took around the turrets. So swimming nice and slowly, and there are over 3,500 photographs taken in that period, including the gaps. You can see the gap in between. So it's like spray painting an object. We've got to get close, and we've got to keep evenly spraying it, kind of using light to spray onto the object, and using the camera to capture the images. And we have to have hundreds of overlapping images to produce the 3D data. The advantage here is it's very cheap to do. It just needs 2 divers and cameras and lights. The disadvantage is with the multibeam data, we can process that very quickly. We can do it pretty much on site. Photogrammetry can take hours, days, and weeks to process. And this is why we're still working on these recs. We've got months and months of work to actually just process the data we already have. So let's see how we apply that. So here's an image of Kari and myself. I'm the one with the yellow fins at the top. Kari's got the camera and lights, and I'm illuminating. I'm the sunlight above. If we do our job properly, we look like synchronized swimmers. And this is on the Royal Oak. It's one section of the Royal Oak. And again, this is back to the turrets. I'll show you some Royal Oak stuff in a second if I've still got time. This is one of the other turrets. This is B turret. And you can see that it's upside down. It's lost a lot of the barbette, which was a step through the different decks. But you can see part of the gun housing to the right-hand side. And as we move around it, if you look at the seabed at the front of it, you'll see just a little semicircle of where the barrels would have stuck out. The barrels are still there. They're just underneath the seabed. And if you look inside the holes in top of the turret, you can see the breeches of the guns, and they are huge. And all of the barrels of all 4 turrets are still on site. They've never been salvaged. Again, same idea. This is the Kronprinz, and the arrow's pointing at the spotting top on the mast. And that's a picture of Emily inside the spotting top, to give you a sense of the scale. A photograph by Mario. And here it is. That's the original multibeam data in the background, and this is the photogrammetry added to replace the multibeam data of the mast. Slight difference in resolution. We're still looking at a point cloud, but the points are much, much closer together. They're millimeters apart from this method. And to give you a sense of that, when I get to the Royal Oak data that you've already seen is 1.5 million points, including the seabed. One of the turrets is 27 million points. Just one of the turrets, which I'll get to as quickly as I can. So here's the Dresden, the stern of the Dresden with a gun, and then that's a little bit of multibeam data photogrammetry data we've managed to get so far from the Dresden. You see the turret there. Just behind the turret is the captain's quarters. And as a testament to German engineering, the bath in there is still full of water. I'm sorry, I've used that about 4 times. What I love about this particular piece of data is what we see in the multibeam data. If you look at the very end of the stern, the last few little grey points there are actually the anchor. And if you look at it in the photogrammetry, we get a really nice kind of rendering of that anchor just sticking out. So back to finish off with the Royal Oak. So that's 1.5 million. And if we just rerun that and go into the first turret there, which is A turret, and we'll dissolve in the photogrammetry data, the A turret. So that's 27 million points there, compared to 1.5 for the rest of the wreck. And we can see the breaches of the guns, so the barrels have swung down to the seabed and popped underneath. And as the weight of the ship has fallen on top of it, it's popped the tops of the turret off. So you can see the lids of the turrets. I don't know if this pointer, I'll not use it, but you can see the flat piece on the seabed is the lid of the turret. And we're able to see, because that's off, we're able to look up inside the turret and see all the controls, and we can see the seats where the gunnery master would have sat and all the crew. It's pretty amazing. A couple of other bits before I finish. This is a spotting top. So this is the very top of the mast, which is still full of a huge number of instruments. And there's some great video footage we've got of this, which shows headphones and binoculars, and all the gauges and all the brass is all there. As we get around to this side, you can see the windows, just looking in there. If you saw any of the BBC coverage, we supplied them with a shot of this, with it being lit from inside the windows. And so that's the first shot on the BBC coverage. So look it up, it's still available on the BBC website and Reporting Scotland. And this is B turret. So, and again, this data, you can see we're now starting to try and join the bits up. So we've got the whole of the turret there with what was on top of this turret was the catapult for a seaplane. There wasn't an airplane on it when it sank, but the catapult was still there. So this jumble of stuff in the foreground underneath the turret is the catapult. And if you look to the top right, the very far right, you can see one of the casemate guns in the multibeam. And then just this side, just to the left of it, is the next casemate gun, but with the photogrammetry. So it gives you a real sense of how much we're getting, extra information we're getting from the photogrammetry data. This is one of my favorite sections of the wreck. There's so much around here. There's a lot of personal items on the seabed. Shaving brushes, soles of shoes, little medicine bottles as well. There's a lot of stuff in here. And then this is the dark side, as referred to it. So this is where the torpedoes hit. And I'm going to end on the second torpedo. The first torpedo hit the bow. The section that is on the seabed just to the left there was actually part of the bow. And for some time, that was still connected to the ship. And it's only in the last 20 years that has fallen off. And also, since we captured the multibeam data in 2006, compared to when we captured the photogrammetry data this year, there's another section of the bow has actually come off. And you can see, as we're getting close to it, these little struts that are sticking out, that had metal hull panels attached to it up until very recently. And that is now on the seabed. And then the last bit I'll show you, this is torpedo 2 damage. And this is kind of important. The violence of this image, for me, really tells the story. This is ripped through 2 bulkheads. You can see at the bottom of the image, you can see the portholes, and they still have lots of artifacts from the crew, because they've all slid down to the portholes. So you can see a lot of stuff. What we found with this data is if we look up into the middle, you won't see it on this. We will release images that will reveal this. If you look up into the damage, we can find the 4-inch shells from the casemate guns, and then to aft of those, we've got the 15-inch shells. And they're revealed through the damage. So the torpedo managed to destroy the bulkhead that was just in front of them, but didn't trigger the shells. And we believe that if it had been 2 meters further to the stern, so 2 meters aft, it would most likely have exploded the magazines with those shells in them. And we would have had something much more like the wreck of Vanguard, which exploded into 1 million pieces. We wouldn't have this intact wreck if that torpedo had been 2 meters further aft, which is kind of terrifying. There are 835 men and boys lost on this wreck in a very short time, and the second torpedo could have made it the full complement. So really interesting part of the story coming out of this data. So we've looked at surveys that have been carried out since 2002, and every time we've had the opportunity, we've developed the techniques. So I think multibeam's probably at the best it's going to be. We're now looking at laser data, subsea laser data, which we used on projects like the Costa Concordia in Italy, and also the Deepwater Horizon, which is the oil rig that sank in the Gulf of Mexico. We're finding that combining the different data actually paints the best picture. So multi-beam for the big picture, and then photogrammetry for the detail, and then working on algorithms to automatically align those two, which is our next big challenge. Further work, so we need repeat surveys to continue on these wrecks, so that we can see how they're changing. We need to engage the diving community, get a bit of citizen science going. We've already run 2 workshops in photogrammetry for divers. They go in there, they'll see a turret, record it, and then we'll say, okay, we've got all the turrets, now start looking at the bits we don't have. And the last thing is we need a community voice to shout and protect the sites even further.